What is policing? How should we understand that concept, its relationship to society, and the kind of problems it brings with it? Let's find out. Hello everyone, welcome back to The Attic. My name's Mark Jago. I'm a lecturer in philosophy in the UK. This is part 2 of my interview with my colleague Koshka Duff on abolishing the police. You can see part 1 linked here. In this part, we're going to talk about what are the alternatives to policing, and we're going to talk a bit about the question of should we be reforming or abolishing the police. So if you're finding this series of videos interesting, why not hit thumbs up on this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to get updates, and leave us a comment. Once again, thanks to Kat Sims for the amazing illustrations and to Abolitionist Futures for the graphics.
An abolitionist perspective is on policing is one that asks, well, what would we have to change about society in order that such a high level of normalised violence wasn't required to uphold it? So the core function of the police to kind of repress dissent, warehouse and brutalise oppressed communities, non-conforming people, and kind of uphold this profoundly unequal and crisis-ridden social order. We don't think that that is a function that we should be looking to just carry out in an alternative way. Nonetheless, there are some genuinely valuable social roles that are currently placed on the shoulders of the police that could be performed much better by alternative and more caring services and institutions. There was a really insightful interview with a former police officer in the United States, and he said he felt that his best work as a police officer was when he was doing work as a kind of, well, as he said, a mediocre therapist. Just as policing is broader than the police as an institution, not everything that the police do is actually policing. And sometimes they're tasked with attending to people who are suffering from mental health crisis, for example, or intervening a situation where someone is rough sleeping and is homeless, and the tasks, the tools that the police are bringing to that task, which is fundamentally that they have weaponry, they're authorised to use and threaten violence. Those are not the best tools for dealing with those kinds of situations. An abolitionist perspective isn't one that just imagines naively that the police could be abolished in isolation while everything carries on as normal. The police are essential to normal as we currently know it. An abolitionist perspective challenges us to ask, what about society would we need to change in order to not require such high levels of normalised violence to maintain it. Abolishing the police is just one part of a much bigger transformative project. It means that we need to radically rethink how housing, healthcare are provided and distributed. It means we need to think about the climate emergency and disability justice, labour rights. One way of understanding what the alternative to policing is democracy. People having a meaningful say in the conditions and institutions that structure our lives, rather than rules coercively imposed from above that ultimately benefit only those at the top. Abolitionists are also interested in developing alternative ways of responding to harm and ways of reducing and preventing harm. And the key contrast here is between kind of punitive or carceral responses on the one hand and transformative justice on the other. So punitive means kind of tied up with punishment, which is about inflicting suffering or harm on someone in response to a perceived transgression or some harm that they are deemed to have caused. And carceral means locking people up, segregating people away from the rest of society. When a harm occurs, a carceral or punitive response encourages us to locate the cause of that problem in an individual bad person, their bad choice, their bad nature, and then kind of isolate and punish that individual, and often kind of stigmatise the community that they're a part of, marking them out as sort of fundamentally different other. We see this playing out in school exclusions along kind of racialised lines, along ableist lines. Those who are disabled or not neurotypical are far more likely to be excluded from school and then subsequently kind of funnelled into the criminal punishment system. Alternative responses to interpersonal harm and conflict and the kind of real social problems that police claim to address but often just exacerbate means embracing a politics of, no one is disposable. And there are many groups that are putting this into practice. For example, the Transformative Justice Collective in Berlin, Communities United Against Violence in the United States. And these alternatives have often been developed in communities where calling the police was never a safe option. But I think it's also important to recognise how difficult it is for these projects to succeed in the circumstances where resources are so scarce and where policing is such a kind of hegemonic, that means a kind of dominant force in society that's kind of sucking up all the resources and kind of meting out more and more harm and trauma on the most oppressed groups in society. There's a false opposition between reform and abolition, in which reform is often understood as making things a bit better in the here and now, and abolition is imagined as kind of razing it all to the ground, total destruction, or just, a pipe dream, nice in theory, not in reality. But actually, abolitionism has always been rooted in on-the-ground struggles. For example, campaigns against prison expansion in the here and now. And that's because abolition isn't just a one-off event, but it's an ongoing process and practice. To quote Sarah Lambo, who's one of the authors in the Abolishing the Police collection, abolition is a way of life and a collective approach to social change. It requires us to engage in strategies that dismantle the structures, institutions and systems that underpin and sustain prisons and police, while at the same time building up systems of care, well-being and support that fulfil human needs and enable communities to flourish. Non-reformist reforms, or abolitionist steps, are strategies that reduce the power and scope of the criminal justice system and reduce our reliance on it, while simultaneously building up our skills, capacities and resources for alternative systems of preventing, addressing and responding to harm. Dan Berger, Mariam Kaba and David Stein, who are three important abolitionists, describe non-reformist reforms as measures that reduce the power of an oppressive system while illuminating the system's inability to solve the crises it creates. And that's in contrast with reformist reforms, which increase the power and funding of policing institutions and kind of help to legitimise them. For example, some examples of reformist reforms would be police body cameras or implicit bias training for officers, recruitment drives among racially oppressed groups. These all give more resources to the police and kind of try to bolster their legitimacy, make them look better. But studies on police use of body cams show that it doesn't make any difference to the way that the police behave. And the footage is most often used against members of the public because at the end of the day, the police control that footage and they kind of use it against those that they are policing rather than it bringing about real change. We can contrast that with the decriminalisation of sex work as a non-reformist reform. that significantly improve the lives, the working conditions of sex workers who are currently targets of policing. Another example of a non-reformist reform would be ban the box campaigns, which are campaigns that stop you having to indicate your background criminal convictions when it's really irrelevant to a job, something that you're applying for. And that helps to reduce what's sometimes called the collateral punishment that people who have been incarcerated are subjected to when they get out of prison and are unable to find employment. Another example is disentangling public institutions like hospitals and universities from the work of immigration policing, which they're kind of currently co-opted into through the hostile environment policies, for instance, that make doctors, educators into border police, keeping tabs on the immigration documents of students and patients.
So that brings us to the end of part 2 of this interview, and thanks once again to Koshka for doing it. In part 3, we're going to be thinking about one of the questions that comes up most often when we're talking about abolishing the police. Well, look, don't we need the police to, for instance, keep us safe? So I hope you stick around for part 3. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to get updates, and leave us a comment. Hope to see you back for part 3.